Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Gooden, and I have the pleasure of serving as Dean of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs here at VCU, and it is truly my pleasure to warmly welcome you to our annual Wilder Symposium. Whether you're here joining us in person tonight or you're tuning in via live stream, we're glad that you're joining us this evening for this most important conversation on the 2024 elections. But before we dive into tonight's discussion, I'd like to take a moment to recognize some of the many distinguished guests who have joined us this evening. We are honored to be in the presence of Dr. Clifton Pay, a member of the VCU Board of Visitors, as well as several esteemed legislators, including Delegate Carr, Delegate Hayes, Delegate Herring, Delegate Aaron Rouse, Delegate Washman, and Delegate Willett, as well as Senator Graves. I also want to acknowledge Judge Eugene Cheek, as well as Judge Roger Gregory, Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals of the Fourth Circuit. We are truly grateful for everyone's presence this evening. I know we have many students here who are interested in politics with us tonight, so I also want to take a moment to highlight our Virginia Capital Semester Program. This spring semester internship offers undergraduate students in any major here at VCU to gain behind-the-scenes access to lawmakers by working directly in the office of a member of the Virginia General Assembly. The deadline to apply is October the 1st. There's information as you first came in, and I encourage you to learn more about this wonderful program. Don't miss that registration deadline of October the 1st, and there's a QR code on the flyers that are in the lobby. As we gather here tonight to discuss the future of our nation, I also want to remind everyone about some important upcoming voting deadlines here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Early in-person voting begins next Friday, September the 20th. I'm sorry, this Friday, September the 20th. I want to tell you the right date. This Friday, September the 20th. The deadline to register to vote is October the 15th. And of course, no matter where you live, Election Day is Tuesday, November the 5th. Your voice matters, so I encourage each of you to take advantage of these opportunities to engage in our democratic process. Before we begin to hear from our speakers, I'd like to take a moment, I gotta do my job as dean, to talk a little bit about something that I'm very proud of, and that's our Wilder School. We are, after all, a top-tier public affairs school, ranked top in the Commonwealth of Virginia, not just here, but in the top 15% nationwide. That's not a small feat because there are nearly 300 schools of public affairs across the country. I'm particularly proud to share with you that our Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness Program is ranked 6th in the nation. Our Research Institute for Social Equity conducts cutting-edge research on inequities in our society, and our signature Commonwealth poll, a poll whose excellence has been recognized by CNN, and you'll hear much more about our poll findings tonight. And I also want to acknowledge our Senior Associate Dean, Dr. J. Barry James, who is president of NASPA, our National Public Affairs Accreditation Organization. So no matter how you cut it, we're proud of the work that we do at the Wilder School and being at the forefront of fostering civic engagement and public policy innovation. But tonight's symposium and our Wilder Symposium is especially dear to us because it is curated by none other than our namesake, the Honorable L. Douglas Wilder, the nation's first elected African-American governor. Although Governor Wilder will be formally introduced momentarily, his generosity, both in terms of his time and his expertise, continues to inspire and motivate us all. And this symposium is just one of the many, many ways he gives back to the community and to our school. Over the years, the Wilder Symposium has covered many, many pivotal topics, including HBCU funding, race in academia, in tonight's session on election 2024. And now it's my privilege to introduce two remarkable figures who will guide us through tonight's discussion. Dr. Bob Holsworth is not only a nationally respected political commentator and expert on politics, but he is also the principal of DecideSmart, the founding director of the Wilder School, and a former member of the VCU Board of Visitors. His contributions to both the academic and public policy landscapes are invaluable, and it is Bob Holsworth that I have to thank because he was the one that recruited me here to VCU more than 20 years ago now. We are also pleased to be joined by Dr. Larry Sabato, a highly respected political analyst and the founder and director of the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. Dr. Sabato's work has helped shape national electoral analysis for decades, with his Sabato's crystal ball being a trusted source for nonpartisan election predictions. His contributions to understanding electoral behavior and political trends have made him one of the most influential voices in the U.S. political commentary. We are also pleased to be joined by our Senior Associate Dean of Research and Outreach, Dr. Robyn McDougle, who leads our Commonwealth poll and has done exceptional work in connecting the work of the Wilder School to the broader community. Now, just a few quick housekeeping notes. As I mentioned, today's presentation is being recorded and live streamed. For those here in the audience, we will be collecting your questions during the panel discussion. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. Volunteers will circulate index cards to you to jot down your questions, and we'll reserve the final 30 minutes of the program to try to get through as many of your questions as possible. And as Stephen said earlier, please share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag WilderSymposium24. We're eager to hear your insights as this important dialogue unfolds. So with that, I'm excited to welcome Bob Holsworth to kick us off.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Susan. Just a few words about the panel in addition to what Dean Gooden has said. First, Dean Gooden is going to join us on the panel this evening. And as you could tell from her remarks, stealing her from Virginia Tech was one of the best decisions I ever made. And I'm also happy that I was involved in the recruitment of Dr. McDougle here as well, who has really both resuscitated and then elevated the Commonwealth poll there. And now with Larry Sabato, I tried to get him to come to VCU, but along with rejecting VCU, Duke, Harvard, and dozens of other places, he can't be wrested out of Charlottesville. So I just want to say a few words about Larry before I introduce the governor. And first, Larry, as Susan noted, has had just a storied career. He is clearly the most prominent university-based commentator on American politics in the country, and has been that for decades. But more than anything else about Larry, what I respect is his absolute fearlessness in his commentary. Whether you go back 30 years ago or 40 years ago when a Democratic governor was trying to suggest that he didn't do some things that he had done, that Larry was there, or whether he's talking about the nature of democracy today, Larry has just always been interested in being truthful, honest, and in telling people what actually is happening, and he does that without fear or favor, and so I've just had enormous respect for him throughout his entire career because of that fearlessness. Now, speaking of fearlessness, there is probably nobody else in Virginia who that adjective describes better than former Governor L. Douglas Wilder. When he first ran for lieutenant governor in 1985, what happened is that many people told him he couldn't win, including most people in his own party, the Democratic Party. They did everything possible to try to prevent him from running. They said he could never win, he would drag down the whole ticket, and ultimately, not only did he win, but it was the turnout that he mobilized that helped Democrats win in Virginia for a number of years. When he became governor, again, the same type of fearlessness. People said you couldn't do a rainy day fund. He did the rainy day fund. In terms of universities, what he saw was that there were a number of people on a board that weren't being helpful to Virginia State University. He went down there and asked for their resignation, as I recall, on that front. And even today, as just a commentator about Virginia politics, he retains the same fearlessness, even if it's talking about his own university squandering over $73 million, and perhaps the largest squandering of state dollars that have ever occurred in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But he's just a fearless individual. He's been a great friend, and having this Wilder Symposium has made an enormous impact in the community for 20 or 30 years. I can recall when we did it about K-12 education, even before you became the first elected mayor in the city of Richmond. So it's my pleasure to introduce 66th Governor of Virginia, L. Douglas Wilder.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much, Bob, and those of you who are assembled. Every now and then I run into some people, they say, well, how are you doing today? I said, I woke up. And that's great. I want to first of all say that we have a stellar, nationally recognized panel here. It's easy to take things for granted sometimes, but Larry Sabato and Bob Holsworth are the best, and they're quoted everywhere. And I like it because we argue and fuss, and we agree and we disagree, but we've always been involved with moving Virginia and our nation forward. Dean Gooden, you're absolutely right, Bob. Getting her from VPI was great, absolutely great. She likes to tell the story of her writing me when she was a student, and I responded. But I'm saying that's one letter I'm glad I wrote to encourage her to be here. And people are always eager to learn. We're talking about elections and the consequences. I want to recognize, I think I saw Dr. Ron Crutcher come in earlier, and his charming wife Betty. Are they there? Because they've been panelists with us before. Doctor, have you? My former law partner and boss, I call him my boss, former chairman of the Board of Visitors here, Roger Gregory. I'm so glad to see you here, Roger. And when you look at some of the things that we've done through the years, I'm reminded of my good friend, Alec McMurtry. Alec McMurtry was a delegate from Chesterfield and Richmond. His delegate, other delegate, used to call it occupied territory because Richmond had annexed a piece of that land. And so I think what we see now in elections, and we're talking about it, Bob, you're absolutely right. Things were going on so bad at Virginia State University that I wanted to have somebody there who knew something about money. So I put the state treasurer over there, Eddie Moore, who'd been comptroller. And there were members of the board that told him he didn't know what he was talking about. And it got so bad, I told my Secretary of Education, he's here, Jim Dyke, Jim, we're going to take the helicopter over there and land it, and we did. Students thought I was coming to see them. They came running out. I went up to the thing and talked to the board members, and I said, Secretary of Education's here with me. He's going to be going around talking to all of you, and this was a Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. By the close of business Friday, I want you all of your resignations. And some of you might be reappointed. Are there any further questions? Got all of those resignations and pointed some people over there who knew something about Virginia State and people. Darrell Dances, Cumberland Dances, one of the purple people in the audience that we put on that board. And so the people need to be involved. The people are always eager to learn. Lack of direct communication. What difference does it make if you get elected? People tell me, I want you to elect me. For what? What have you done? What have you tried to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? When did you fail and why did you fail? Well, I want to move up. Up to what? This is not a situation of graduating preceding degrees. Well, I served here first and I said, no, I don't care where you served. Point to it. And the undue influence of money in politics today is just ungodly. I mean, the kind of money that these people are throwing away, and I mean that, I don't mind saying it. Johnny Blouse, I see you out there, you write it. His dad was my predecessor as governor, and we had long talks about money long talks. So I want to say to people here today, I want, when you ask your questions, see what influence it has on all of the people. I want them to know what they've done to merit re-election and what they need to do to further our election. That government closest to the people is that government which most affects their livelihoods, their schools, their health care, and their survival. And I want you to make certain that you ask of them those kinds of questions, and there are those who need to be responsive and more responsive to being where they are. God bless you and thank for us being here. We're going to have a lovely time.
Thank you, Governor. Let's now turn to Dr. Sabato. I'm not sure the crystal ball is completely clear yet, but I think he can give us a great analysis of the landscape of American politics in the 2024 election.
How many minutes? Oh, 5 to 10. Boy, I don't think I could give you a summary of what's happening here in 5 to 10 minutes. But look, we're in unprecedented territory. We always seem to find our way there. But a lot of us who've been around for a while remember certain parts of 1968 that remind us of what's been happening here. And it's, of course, the essential resignation of a president's nomination, which has never happened before. That puts 2024 in a special category. But 1968, for those who lived through it, you know what a tumultuous year it was, how difficult it was for the country, how many terrible crises occurred and problems that we had no answer for, and things seemed dark and gloomy. And people were actually questioning, especially after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, they were questioning whether the country could really hang together. We're in the middle of a very unpopular war. But we did hang together. We came through the fire, and it wasn't easy, and we had a lot more trials to go through, including Watergate, which lasted for years. Things weren't easy, but we survived, and eventually we prospered. And I think the same thing will happen this year, because I want all of us to wake up tomorrow, Governor. I don't want to be negative. I think it's very important that we all wake up tomorrow. So I'm just simply telling you we'll get through it. But what are we getting through? Well, we have a very unpredictable choice. Nobody could have believed a few years ago, or certainly right after January 6th, that we would have Donald Trump back as the nominee of his party for the third consecutive time. After having, and I think I'm just stating a fact here, it's not partisan, after he had essentially staged the first self-coup or coup d'etat by an incumbent president to overthrow the Constitution. That's what he was doing. He was trying to steal a presidential term. And if there's anybody in here who thinks that he thought that the election was actually stolen, as opposed to it didn't turn out the way he wanted, meaning he didn't win, then I've got a beautiful rotunda I want to sell you. It's right in Charlottesville. I know it isn't connected to VCU or VSU, but you know, it's a nice rotunda. Governor Wilder's been in there many times. You know what happened. I know what happened. We all know what happened. And the Democratic nominee, she's had to step up and face tremendous difficulties just to become the nominee. I have to say, this is the only way, whether you think she's going to win or not, whether you think she's good or not, this is the only way that Donald Trump could possibly have been kept out of the White House. Because President Biden, for all the good things that he's done and the good qualities that he may have, he was headed for defeat. On what scale, it's impossible to say, but I don't think there was any way for him to come back. Let's just say he didn't age as well as Governor Wilder. You know, I mean, it's true. He's got more energy and brain power than the rest of us put together. You give me hope. I've told you that before. You give me hope. Anyway, the point is, we've got this matchup where the people really have had very little exposure to one of the candidates and has had too much exposure to the other one. This is a very strange development. And if you were running Donald Trump's campaign, you'd run it very differently. You would keep him in the background more, but of course that's impossible because he won't permit it. And you would also focus him on the things that can elect him, like whether you agree or disagree, his positions on economics or the problems with inflation, the problem at the border. He claims there's a crime problem, and there is in some places, but it's way down, actually. Crime rate is way down. But these are the things that could actually elect him. But he has found other critical problems in America that do need to have us pay attention, like the size of crowds. This is something that it's very important that we all measure the number of people who turn up at his rallies versus other people's rallies. And what a great determination of who should be president. I'm being sarcastic. I don't know. I guess you don't know me as well as I thought you did. But it's a strange campaign. It's gotten stranger by the day. But I have to tell you that things are going in a direction that most people didn't think they would go in. At first, in the summer, as I said, it looked like Donald Trump was going to win, to the extent that Virginia, at least briefly, appeared to be competitive. I don't know in the end whether it would have been. I'm kind of with Bob. I think we both agree that in the end, Biden would have carried Virginia, but it would have been 2 or 3 points instead of his 10 from 2020. Well, with the new nominee, who had a terrific convention that was energetic, that built enthusiasm in the Democratic Party, followed by a terrific debate that was a debate to remember, just as the one that occurred June 27th was one to remember. But she's had a great 2 months as nominee. Maybe this is the way we should do it in the future. I mean, the British only take 6 weeks, to do the whole kit and caboodle. So things are looking surprisingly good for her, at least in the national polls. And your poll was right on target, right on the mark there, with I think a 10-point lead for Harris here in Virginia. It won't be that big nationally, and just winning by, say, 4 or 5 points, which I think is well within her potential to do, does not guarantee her the Electoral College. We have a wonderful system bequeathed to us by the founders. Of course, it was designed in part to support that great institution of slavery. It failed, and it's still failing in another way, but we're stuck with it. Or as I like to tell people, if you don't like the Electoral College, the abolition of it is coming, and it's on the calendar. And the date is the 12th of never. So we're not going to change it because it's impossible to change anything anymore in America. You couldn't get a constitutional amendment for Mother's Day passed and ratified. I'm serious. We would disagree about who's a mother. So it's not going to be gone. I've got my list, but I don't think it's what other people have in mind when you talk about mothers, but that's something I shouldn't say. Thank you for laughing. I appreciate it. So I see this as Virginia reverting to form, being bluish, and eventually voting for the Democratic ticket. But I also see almost all the other states reverting to form and voting red or blue or being extremely close. We're a country down to 7 states. 43 states simply watch the other 7 to see who's going to be president, which is deeply disturbing. We're no longer the country we used to be. In 1960, more than half of the states were extremely competitive in the JFK-Nixon contest, and they were very close. And now we have 7 states. And not all of them may be close in the end, but you're watching 7 states. And we're not one of them. Doesn't mean we're not important. We've got plenty of things going on here. Plenty of mistakes to correct. I guess I shouldn't go into that either. Bob, you're the one who put that idea in my head. I'm going to blame you for that one. But I think it's going to be an interesting campaign. It's going to be fun to watch. But remember, like most people, while what we do here matters, we're going to be watching what happens in some other states that really matter in terms of putting 270 electoral votes together. And to me, that is deeply regrettable. And so I'm going to start on a really negative note to make all of you look better. I want you to be positive and upbeat and make me regret what I said, which I frequently do.
Thanks so much, Larry. You know, one point that I would just mention here, I think if you're Donald Trump today, you're looking at some of your key advisors and saying, why did you tell me to do a debate in June before the Democratic convention? You know, that he would have much preferred to have waited now and to have Biden have that performance after he had been nominated. Because that debate was the catalyst for all of the effort to move Biden out, which he eventually did, and let Harris be the nominee. We're going to talk now about some of the issues that we've heard here in Virginia, and Dr. McDougle is going to go over some of the poll results that I think you have with you yourself out there. Robyn?
Dr. Holsworth, thank you so much. And as Dean Gooden mentioned, I have the honor and privilege of working on the Commonwealth poll very closely with Governor Wilder. And so you do have with you, when you came in, you received a handout of our most recent poll results, which came out last Monday. And as Dr. Sabato mentioned, our poll does show Vice President Harris up by 10 over President Trump. This is a great change, as Dr. Holsworth mentioned. When we had our poll in July, we actually had President Trump up by 1 over President Biden. So exactly as we've been hearing tonight about the change in Democrat nominee and the impact on voter behavior in Virginia, we're seeing it in the Commonwealth poll. The other important points to point out here with you is that we are consistently seeing in our presidential polls that more and more Virginians are identifying themselves as independents when it comes to presidential polling. 46% of our respondents in this poll, 43% in our July poll identified as an independent, which is a really important point for us to note too. In our gubernatorial election in 21, that number was 19%. And Governor Wilder and I were floored by that 19% in 21 as seeing individuals as independent. So when Governor Wilder and Dean Gooden mentioned the voice of the people, truly in Virginia, that voice is being carried not just in our Republican and Democrat parties, but by our independents as well. When you talk about why people are voting in this election, consistently we're seeing cost of living as being the #1 issue that Republicans identify and independents identify. In July, our Democrats reported that reproductive rights were #1 and cost of living was #2. But in this most recent poll that we released on Monday, they've actually identified cost of living as their #1 reason for voting, followed very closely second to reproductive rights. And then third across the board is immigration. So as Governor Wilder mentioned, the issues that Virginians see as important are consistently pointed out. It is one of the things that I take great pride in with our Commonwealth poll. We really do look at not only voting behavior, but policy issues. How do Virginians look at issues of education, issues of the economy, issues around reproductive rights, issues around, the cost of education for higher education, something that we consistently track. And Peter Blake, who's in the audience, has always given us the audience to present at our Chev President's Councils annually to see that, Virginians over the last several years have questioned the cost of higher education versus the worth of what they're getting. Virginians are telling us things that we should pay attention to as policymakers, as legislators, as academics, and as everyday people, because as Governor Wilder always points out, the people always lead first, and they're continually showing this in our poll. The other thing I'll point out to you is that we dropped into the field immediately after last week's debate. So we will have a new poll coming out that will assess voter behavior as impacted by the debate last week and as impacted by the attempted assassination on Sunday as well. So we'll see the impacts that they have on any movement in that current 10% lead that the Vice President has over President Trump.
Quickly, and that is, in the poll, you have all these independents. What's the breakdown between Democrats and Republicans that you're seeing in Virginia?
Yes, so it's a really good point. So right now, in our July poll that I mentioned when President Biden was still on the ticket, we saw that President Trump was leading in independents 19-6. President Biden had 6%, President Trump had 19. When we saw the change in two things, both the vice president becoming the Democrat nominee and Robert Kennedy Jr. stepping out in the independent space, we saw that Vice President Harris picked up. She's now at 16% in the independents. President Trump went to 27%. We account really for that, I think, as a big majority of that increase as a result of RFK Jr. getting out of the race and endorsing President Trump. I would also point out that we have over 10% of our respondents looking at Cornel West and Jill Stein. 22% of our respondents haven't decided who they're going to vote for that identify as independents. So there is still a very good chunk out there. And then you've got 11% that are displeased with all of their choices. And so there's a lot out there for either candidate, but I do think that the increase we saw most recently for President Trump really did align with Kennedy getting out. And the increase with Vice President Harris over President Biden does show, as everyone has said, her popularity among younger independents, younger female independents. You're seeing that movement occur since she's come into the race.
Thanks so much. I think the percentage of double haters is actually down from where it was prior. Now I'm going to turn to Dean Gooden for her comments on the landscape.
Well, I wanted to structure my comments. Tonight's symposium is entitled The Importance of Listening to the People. And one way to listen to the people is to listen to their votes. But to listen to their votes, they have to be counted. And the counting of votes is governed by a lot of rules, people, and processes. Why is this important? Well, at the state level, almost all states have modified their voting rules since 2020. Some states have made it easier to vote. Some have made it more difficult to vote. The other word for that would be an emphasis on access versus an emphasis on voter integrity. Those are sort of largely the two arguments. And largely, they have been surrounded around counting absentee votes, ID requirements, as well as securance and surveillance of drop boxes. Well, why is this important? Well, this is important because there are many states, battleground states, where the election is anticipated to be close, and for the results of that to ultimately drive the outcome of this election. So trustworthy and accountable electoral processes are a core element of democracy. Now, in 2020, 5 states, the outcome were determined by less than 2%. In fact, 2 states, Arizona and Georgia, were, you may recall, decided by less than 1/2 of a percentage point. So the counting of ballots and who has access to the ballot becomes really, really important. So what are some of the things that have occurred? Looking at some of the battleground states, we'll take Georgia, for example. They have become more restrictive. They're restricting the availability of drop box locations, particularly in large urban areas, making it more difficult to receive or cast mail ballots, and the state election board in Georgia is now more partisan. In Pennsylvania, and in fact throughout the country, we've had lots of turnover in election officials themselves. 1/3 of the election officials have turned over in the United States since the 2020 election. You may recall harassment of election officials. I mean, it just wasn't a very pretty or pleasant time. So we're going to have many election officials who will be new this presidential term in counting votes for the presidential election. So you got a combination of new rules and new people. And that means that there could be a lot of uncertainty and potentially chaos in terms of counting the election results. Because of course there's going to be the implementation of these policies as well as discretionary and gray areas. If we look to our neighbor to the south, North Carolina, which has become a battleground state, they have added more barriers to voting. They in fact have the most strict mail voting ID requirements in the country. Absentee voters mail a copy of a qualifying ID with their ballots in order for their ballot to be counted. So these strict voting requirements that are happening across the nation, especially in these battleground states, will be something to keep an eye on. Now, the states that I mentioned heretofore, we've been talking about them as battleground states with more restrictions on voting or having the voting integrity argument. Those that have gone the voting access route, we look at Michigan. They have dramatically expanded their access to voting, including same-day registration, much easier to vote by mail, and an increase in drop box access across the state. Nevada, another battleground state, has also been in that category of opening up access, having more universal mail voting, and placing more drop boxes on Native American reservations and in Native American communities. And just for sake of curiosity, although Virginia is no longer looked at as a battleground state in this election, just to see how we compare, in 2020, under then a Democratic governor, but with consensus from both the General Assembly and both houses of the General Assembly, House of Delegates, and the Senate, access to voting expanded in 2020, increasing the number of State Board of Election members from 3 to 5. 3 are appointed and are the party of the sitting governor, and the other 2 are of the opposite party. The chair and the vice chair, the chairs are from opposing parties. State funding for elections has also improved to improve voting integrity. Under the Youngkin administration, there has been, you may recall, quite a bit of focus on this issue, particularly in August when he issued Executive Order 35. So when we vote in Virginia, all of us will be using paper ballots. There has been a focus on accuracy on the voting list, purging the list of those who are ineligible to vote, including, of course, felons and non-citizens. But there's been a bit of an asterisk there because some of the citizens, the individuals who were removed in error and therefore had to be added back. So I say all this to say, with the closeness that we expect in these elections, when we're coming to listening to the people, it's important that we're able to count their votes. And the landscape and the changes that have been put into place raise into question whether these issues will be decisive issues in this election. I should also just mention in closing that when these issues trickle into the state and federal courts, you know, Americans no longer have the same view of the judiciary as they did before. So if we think back, for example, to 2020, when we had the historic Gore-Bush election, the Supreme Court ruling there, that's been now 24 years ago. You think about Florida and all the hanging chads and swinging chads and all that. It seems like last year's news. But confidence in the Supreme Court to make the decision was far higher than it is now. So those are some things that I think we haven't talked as much about, but are important aspects as we think about the 2024 elections. Thank you.
Yeah. Great presentation. Susan, extraordinarily helpful. I'd like to expand on that a little bit for a question for you and then Larry. What do you expect, if it's a close election, to see in terms of the battle over the results? Because you have states that are not going to finish counting for a couple of days and maybe longer that'll be there. You know, what comes next after the election? What's the battle like?
Well, I think that we don't know what the nature of the issue is, but certainly is clear on both campaigns. I think having people in place, first of all, vetting who these election officials are, has been a critical part of the process. Going through the judicial system for an outcome. I mean, my concern is that I think, especially with the change in rules, that we may be in a lot of uncharted territory relative to making decisions in this regard. And I think the other, not to sound negative, but I think the other issue is that, the propensity to violence among election officials, among judges that are deciding these cases, we're in a very challenging period relative to political violence and the propensity for it here in this country.
Well, what Dean Gooden just said is absolutely correct, and you know how upbeat and positive I am. So I'll try to stay on that plane, but I'm deeply concerned. I really am, and I don't get concerned about everything all the time. I've never had an ulcer, and I hope never to have one. But all of us should be very concerned about what's coming. Now, if the election turns out to be substantially one-sided, which, by the way, assuming it's Harris who wins, would be the best thing that ever happened to the Republican Party, because they need to repudiate this guy and go back to some kind of mainstream, moderate conservative somewhere in their party. It's a two-party system. We need two parties. So you've got the Democrats, moderate liberal or centrist liberal, and then the Republicans, centrist right. Well, right now you've got too many kooks, frankly, crazies on the Republican side. And if you doubt me, look at the number of death threats and acts of violence that have been committed against average, normal citizens who are simply trying to do their job to help their locality, their state, their country by managing elections. We used to celebrate these people. We used to salute them. And now many people, understandably, are afraid to continue. You've seen all of the interviews. Most of you have seen the numbers. You should look at the FBI numbers on threats to election officials. When you don't have leadership at the top of a party that will tell the party members, we always want to win, but we lost. And as is often said, the test of a democracy is accepting an election you lose, not just accepting an election you win. You don't need any virtue to accept an election you win. But that's where we are. That's where we are. And it shows us what happens and how fast things can deteriorate when we, the people, listening to the people, Governor, we, the people, allow individuals who should not be in leadership positions, we let them rise to leadership positions. It's not that difficult with social media to construct a cult. And we've all seen it in the past few years, and it's dangerous. And it's got to stop, and it's not going to stop with us being ostriches and putting our heads in the sand. It's going to stop when we stand up and say, that's it, no more.
know, it almost seems quaint, but I remember a day not so long ago in Virginia where we had a very important House of Delegates election, which was a tie, and nobody complained about, you know, votes being this way or that way, and they just picked the winner out of a bowl. And I also remember another election a while back that was one of the closest gubernatorial elections in Virginia history, where a candidate won, and at the end of it, you either have a recount or you don't have a recount, but the results were accepted. And right now, it looks like the election's only stage one. We then have the battle over the election. Governor, I'd like to turn a little bit to candidates, however, and I wanted to ask you this question. That Kamala Harris is obviously a unique candidate in the sense that if she wins, she'll be the first woman president, first woman of color to be the president, and she's running a campaign that doesn't speak about that very much directly. When you ran, you were going to be a trailblazer not just for Virginia, but for the nation. Everybody else spoke about that. You didn't always speak about that. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the approach you took, what you think of the approach Harris is taking, and how important that is for the public?
Well, it's a good observation. You're absolutely right. I think what she's doing now, by not accentuating the fact that she's a woman, and we look at her and see that, I guess, but these days you might not be able to tell, but nevertheless, she is not accentuating race. And I never did. And I didn't because I wasn't running as a black person. I was running as a candidate, and I wanted to be certain that people understood that I wasn't running to represent black people, white people, tan, brown, yellow, whatever. I ran to represent the people of Virginia. And you couldn't get baited into those kinds of things, you know, when people would ask you, well, what do they think about this and what do they think about that? Well, I thought I was pretty popular when I ran. Well, I shouldn't say that. When I ran for the lieutenant governorship, I was in Roanoke, I remember very well. And I'd given a man my grip card to look at it, to tell him what I was trying to do and looking for. And I went on a little bit. I looked at, he had thrown it in the trash before I could get past. And I told him who I was, and he asked me the same thing that I've been bringing up here this afternoon. Who are you? You say you're running for office? What does that mean to me? What have you done? What have you tried to do? Well, you know, I tried to do this, I tried to do that. Did you get anything done? So I decided that I would want, and as you noticed, I stayed in nothing but homes of the people on the road. I didn't stay in hotels or motels. And people didn't know me. And it's the job of those people who are running for office to get people to know you. It's your job, it's your responsibility. Know you, not just that your name is XYZ, but what do you stand for? What do you fight for? And so I think one of the more important things that we did in Virginia is be one of the first states to show that race doesn't matter. My running mate on the ticket for Attorney General was a woman. She was the first woman Attorney General. That didn't matter. What matters is what's most important to the people. Spell it out. But I did learn one thing that has never changed, and I don't think it ever will. Money matters.
Let me follow up with even another question, though, about your role and what you did in American history. You were the first African-American elected governor. Since that time, there have only been two others, Deval Patrick and Wes Moore. In Massachusetts and Maryland, two of the bluest states in the country, you were able to do this in a state that at the time was not blue. How did you do that, and why do you think the only folks who have been elected since then of color to the governorship have been in the deep blue states?
Well, you look at this, though. The current lieutenant governor is not a Democrat. She's a woman, and she's black. She got elected. I think, and as Susan was pointing out, battleground states, swing states. I used to, as you know, call Virginia a purple state, not blue nor red. I call it a people state. I think, and I mean this, I think the people of Virginia are more interested in who is running and what they're running for than anything else. And if you look at the candidates who are running now, I think one of them is in the audience, that was in the audience today from Virginia Beach, Lieutenant Governor Rouse, he's running. You got Stoney from the mayor of Richmond, he's running. I looked at both of them before, look at them now, both of them are black. And I don't think that anybody's holding that against them, nor should they believe that's a badge to cause them to believe that they're going to be elected or being given any consideration. So I think race is being pushed back further in terms of consideration. But eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.
Larry, if I could ask you to, since you've been so prominent commentator for so many years, what are the biggest changes that you've seen in Virginia over the years in terms of the electorate, the trends, and how do you see that moving forward?
Again, do I have an hour? I need an hour, really, to do this, but I won't.
We have an hour and 4 minutes.
Yeah,
but.
thanks a lot. Well, I was born in 1952, and at that time, of course, the Bird Organization ran everything. Even in my home city of Norfolk, which is considered a liberal city, and was kind of back then. They didn't trust cities like Norfolk, but they ran Norfolk. You know, they had the mayor, and they had all the constitutional officers and everything else. And that didn't change really until the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act and the abolition of the poll tax. One little funny story, and my mother hates it when I tell this story, but she's deceased. So I could go ahead and tell it. It was 1964, and we were watching the election returns as a family, and of course Lyndon Johnson won a massive landslide and was declared the winner almost immediately. But right after that, Harry Byrd Sr., governor, was announced as the winner of the Senate seat for the umpteenth time. He'd been in since 1933. But the reaction was my mother turned to my father. She wasn't that interested in politics. My father was a World War II vet, loved it. So my mother turned to my father and said, "How can that be? We never vote for him. No one we know ever votes for him, and he always wins." And which is really the source of why people think there's voter fraud and other things. They think everybody's like them. Everybody's like them and their friends. Unfortunately, in this case, everybody wasn't like them and their friends. But we finally began to change in the 1960s. And it's no accident, Governor Wilder was elected to his first office, the state senate, in 1969. Virginia had begun to change. And it didn't change very rapidly, and it didn't change as thoroughly as it should. But it did begin to change. But it changed in another way. Instead of being solidly Democratic, those former Democrats, the Byrd Democrats, decided, well, we can't control the Democratic Party anymore. We'll just take over the Republican Party and control them. And sure enough, that's exactly what they did. And that lasted really until, I guess, the 80s. Well, it was you and Beliles and Rob and so on that changed the perspective on that. And then things really changed, obviously, in the new century because of the new demographics and the fact that a majority of Virginians were not born in Virginia. They were non-natives. This was heresy to Virginians of a prior century, that a majority of Virginians wouldn't be born in Virginia. So these demographic changes, the political changes, new generations who demanded higher standards, better standards, more progress, all of these things played a role. But nothing's secure, nothing's guaranteed, and we have to continue to fight to see progress. It's not just going to happen. You have to make sure that each new generation understands the stakes. And that's what we try and do in the classroom. And when they're awake, I think they take that in.
Let me follow up on that with Susan and then the governor. And I want to go back to the issue of race, particularly the teaching about it. And so here that I've noticed at VCU that the faculty and the students wanted some courses on racial literacy and the history, the true history of America and of Virginia. And they wanted that to be part of a general ed curriculum. There was a vote to do that. And then a governor got upset with that, said it was more of a course that was going to be too woke or whatever. And largely the board reversed course and voted and took it away from that. So now we have this situation where you had faculty that supposedly controlled the curriculum, no longer controlled the curriculum, and it was about a particular issue, which was really the teaching of American history and the role of race in it. So what's your sense of where we're going on that?
Well, I think, as Governor Wilder said earlier, you got to look at our Board of Visitors. I mean, the Board of Visitors and the actions, I think that question goes to them. Why did they feel that they could overrule the will of the faculty and the support that teaching these courses had? And where is that legitimacy that comes from? And so I think we have to hold members of our Board of Visitors, I think we have to hold our governor more accountable on these issues. Now, in terms of where we go from here relative to race, I've always said that race and social equity is a nervous area of government. And it's a nervous area of government because we've got all this history relative to race that was put in place by and implemented by governmental institutions at the federal, state, and local level, born in separate hospitals, buried in separate cemeteries. These were all government policies. And so to right these wrongs, we've had studies of millions of dollars that HBCUs have been underfunded as academic institutions, even though they have punched above their weight relative to outcomes among African American students. So it goes to, we have to favor equity in and out of season. It can't just be when the tides are, the political tides are quote unquote on our side. When it's the right thing to do, as Governor Wilder says, then it's always the right thing to do. And I think that the decision of the Board of Visitors was a poor one.
Governor?
Wow. You talk about a tough lady. I agree. I was very disappointed when the governor had his people contact the dean and me and specifically pointed to the word equity and said, can you get rid of that word? And I was puzzled. I said, get rid of what word? Equity. And what would you put in place of it? Opportunity. I said, we are teaching about history. We're talking about going back and making certain that people understand what is and from whence we've come. And it got so when I ultimately did get a chance to speak to the governor about it. As lawyers in the audience would know, we had law and equity courts right here in the city of Richmond. The courts of equity in Great Britain were the springboard of attaching themselves to issues that were not spelled out directly in the law. In other words, fairness, unfairness. And how do you equate with that, and how do you get to that? And how can a governor ask and request syllabi from only 2 schools in the university and system, VCU and VMI? When we know what has happened at VMI, governor masquerading at his graduation symposium, current superintendent, through that previous governor's expropriating of $1 million for a study, and said that sexism and racism still exist at VMI. Not did exist 100 years ago. So what is it that you are objecting to? That hasn't been answered to me yet. But the sticks-to-itness of the dean are such. As she said, no, we are not going to change it. And so I think you asked a very important question, Bob. The governor appoints the members of the Board of Visitors, who then select the president. The president is not selected by the people as such, nor the members of the board selected by the people as such. But the people do make the ultimate choice with the governor. And there, quite frankly, has been a failure in this instance, one that needs to be corrected, one that needs to be spoken to and out by the members of the board. Whether that speaking out brings success or not isn't important. Speak out. If you're the only voice, let us hear you.
Yeah. Robyn, if I could just bookmark this, is there any evidence that you have in the polls about what the public is thinking about teaching of race in Virginia schools?
Yes, so last spring, Governor Wilder and I had a question in our spring 2024 poll that did ask both citizens' views on race being taught in K-12 and race being taught in higher education, the history of race being taught in K-12 and the history of race being taught in higher education. In both questions, a majority of Virginians support history being taught in K-12 and history being taught in higher education. So, you know, it was not a confusing or concerning question to them. It was a pretty directly straightforward question.
Let me turn a little bit to another part of the election that we haven't spoken about, and that is the senatorial and congressional elections. If I could turn to Larry again to kind of tell us a little bit about the landscape and what you're seeing there, because that outcome, obviously, depending on who wins the presidency, is also going to have a very important role in what happens next in America.
Sure, and Virginia is easy, obviously. I think the incumbent senator will win. That took a lot of courage, didn't it, to come up with that prediction? But, yeah, exactly. It's the other candidate, I've been told even by Republicans, doesn't appear to be campaigning very vigorously. So anyway, we know what's going to happen there. The couple of races are close enough in Virginia, those House races, the 7th and the 2nd, so that possibly they could switch incumbents. They're reasonably close. The other ones, as is typical for House elections, are totally one-sided thanks to both polarization and redistricting. You know, the election's over before it's even held, and they wonder why people aren't interested. But nationally, I'd have to say this. I think the Republicans, because of the seats up in the Senate, and because the Senate, as an institution, is now, just like the Electoral College, tilted to the Republican Party, they're very likely to take control of the U.S. Senate, but not by very many seats. In fact, today, I think it would be 51-49. They've already got West Virginia. Boy, some of us can remember when West Virginia, I don't think they even knew what a Republican was. Every single office was held by the Democrats, and now it's exactly the reverse, but that seat's gone. Manchin's seat is gone to the Republican governor. The one seat that is most likely to switch to the Republicans other than West Virginia is Montana, and I think it's happening. John Tester, who's the Democratic incumbent, has been in for 18 years, and it's a miracle that he's managed to get elected 3 times. But Montana has become more and more and more conservative and pro-Trump. And so I think it's likely the Republicans will win that one. That's 51-49. The other one that's up in the air is Ohio. Senator Sherrod Brown, another Democrat in a state that used to be a bellwether and very closely contested, and now is 54-46, 55-45 Republican. I think Brown can still win that. It's going to be very close, but it's superfluous in a way. If you've got 51-49, you don't really need 52-48, because the only other number that matters is 60, and nobody's going to have 60. The Republicans aren't going to have 60. Now, House of Representatives is interesting. If Harris wins, and if it's by some decent margin, I think the Democrats really should win the House by a few seats. It's not going to be a landslide, but they ought to win by a few seats. If it's close, even if Harris wins and it's close in the popular vote, then the Republicans could very easily hang on, despite the way they've governed over the past 2 years. Again, an inattentive public does not necessarily hold people accountable for their behavior. Now, if she wins a lot, Democrats can win. If she wins by a little, or if Trump wins, almost certainly the Republicans will keep the House of Representatives. Think for a second about what it would mean to have Trump in term 2, not term 1. Term 1, he had kind of respectable people in at least a few key positions who could hold him back. They're gone. Every one of them is gone. Most of them have said they will not vote for Trump under any conditions, or they've outright endorsed Harris. When was the last time somebody's vice president said that under no circumstances will I vote for the president who picked me and for whom I served for those 4 years? And then Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of State, and just, you go right down the line. Unbelievable. He's going to bring in some of the most radical people you could imagine. He's already got them around him. Term 2 will be very different than term 1, and most of you won't like it one little bit. I made you happy? Are you feeling a little bit better? Or, you know. This is why my course evaluations are so bad. So it's just...
Governor, let me ask you this, that you look at these polls right now, and you see there's a certain level of support for the candidates, then you say, is the country moving in the right direction? Vast majority say no, maybe for different reasons. You ask about the approval of Congress, it's at 14%. I always say I didn't know they had that many relatives on that front. But is there anything that you see on the horizon that could make this system work better than it has? Because it just seems that it just simply doesn't work in Washington any longer.
I think the involvement of young people and the interest that they show, if they maximize it, they can make a difference. They can clearly make a difference. I think also the simplicity of the issues needs to be better explained. What are you talking about when you speak about housing? What do you mean when you speak about health care? But I always get back to, and you know this well, money. Who is handling the money? Who is wasting the money? How can you look around and see the waste and then you say to others, we cannot do anything about it? Tuition increases and lack of affordability, and yet people, students, parents look around and see the waste at these levels. And so I think relativity, I still think the better and the more involved people get. Incidentally, I think the election in Virginia and most of these close states, it's not a matter of what the polls show. These are going to be turnout elections. Who is going to be motivated to get out and vote? Not who wants to vote. Who's going to get up and go out and vote and do it early, not when you get a chance, but to make it the #1 issue of the day.
Yeah, Larry, to go back to just that question there, in terms of enthusiasm and in terms of voting, are the Republicans at a disadvantage to some degree because of Donald Trump's skepticism about mail voting and early voting and those kind of matters?
Well, that was one of his problems in 2020. He was telling the Republican activists, don't trust the mail, don't go vote early. It's all fixed. You wait till election day and you vote, you get in line and vote on election day. All well and good, although I don't agree with his criticism of mail voting or in-person voting. But the problem is, things come up on election day. Remember when we did have to vote on election day for the most part? Well, sometimes you were sick and you didn't want to go in. Sometimes, you know, one of the kids got sick or you had to run an errand. You didn't show up at the polls. This gives you so many options to vote. You have absolutely no excuse for not casting a ballot. Can I just add one thing? Because Governor Wilder, this is actually a positive thing I want to say. You mentioned the young, youthful generation and so on. That is what restores my faith. It's why I love going in a classroom, because they do care, and they do have the energy and enthusiasm for higher turnouts than they've had before. And they really do care about, you know, climate change and equity and all of these things that older generations perhaps have become cynical about. And so I do have hope because of them, and they're determined to change things. I hope they won't lose that spirit and that energy as they get older. But as long as they don't, we'll be much better off in 50 years than we are today.
We're now going to turn to your questions. So here's the first one. I'm going to ask it for Larry, and then I'm going to ask everybody else to chime in, and I'll do it myself too. Regardless of the outcome of the 2024 presidential race, what do you think the future holds for Governor Glenn Youngkin, both in Virginia and on the national stage?
You would ask me. Look, you can have all kinds of opinions about him. And, you know, when I talk to people about him, they say, well, he's very imposing and he's very tall. That's the first thing everybody says, very tall. I didn't know that was in the Constitution. I didn't know that made any difference at all, but apparently it does to some people. Look, when he was elected, people thought, for whatever reason, and I think the media deserves some part of the blame here as well, they thought, Washington Post, they thought that he was going to be some kind of new Linwood Holton. He was a moderate conservative. You know, he was with it. You know, he got all the new wrinkles about politics and society. Well, he didn't, and he doesn't. He is much further to the right than people knew. He was very careful to shield a lot of that from the electorate. But I'll tell you what, really, and I'm sure he's done some good things and so on. I don't follow what he does every day. As you can tell, I'm depressed enough already, so I don't try to get into that. But the one thing that has really turned me off to him, and always will, is that with the one-term limit, you don't have to worry about running for re-election. Yeah, I know he wants to run for president, he wants to do this, he wants to do that. But you don't have to immediately run for re-election. Not once, not one single time has he ever even criticized Donald Trump. Remember? I mean, from the very beginning, I got into this race because of the wonderful things that President Trump did. This was after January 6th. And all he has done is play up to Trump. I know it's for political reasons. That's kind of my field. I get that part. But it doesn't mean you have to admire it or respect it. And he's never said a critical word about Trump's role in January 6th. He's never said a critical word about the things that Trump has said and done over and over and over again. And then when he thought Trump was reelected, which a lot of people did, as the Republican convention opened, right after the first assassination attempt, remember, it was all over. And he'd already beaten Biden in the debate on June 27th, so it was over. So he flies to the Republican convention, stands next to Donald Trump. You all saw this. Stands next to Donald Trump and led the cheers for Donald Trump. Well, okay, you know, I guess we can all be cynical and say, well, that's just politics. Sometimes politics asks too much. Party asks too much. What do you believe in? What do you stand for? What do you stand for? Do you care about the Constitution? Because if you do, I just don't understand how you can be enthusiastic about Donald Trump.
After that, I'm going to put Robyn on the spot here, because some of your polls show that Governor Youngkin has a pretty decent well of support in Virginia.
Yes.
What does that mean for his political future?
I'm not going to at all attempt to figure out what that means for his political future, but you are right. Our polls continually show that he has a positive approval rating, that it did decrease in our July poll, so that was interesting. It came down a bit there. Governor Wilder and I both thought that was very interesting and kind of a bit telling in that space. But consistently, we'll see. We won't poll again on his overall approval ratings until post-election, before we go into the General Assembly. But he has consistently had, high numbers in approval ratings, and that goes along with our General Assembly as well. Consistently strong numbers in Virginia of approval ratings of our General Assembly in the House and the Senate. So I can tell you that Virginians think that the members of the General Assembly are doing a good job. I think that they are comfortable with what Governor Youngkin has done thus far in his gubernatorial term. I could not predict, nor would I want to predict, what will happen, in his next phase of either a political career or a private sector career. But as of right now, he's likable, and people think positively of him pretty consistently in Virginia.
Governor, you want to weigh in on this one?
I think the jury's out as it relates to how you pass on it. It's a 4-year term. It's a very short term. And the polls that we take, as you know, are favorability, not issue. Not as it relates to crime, safety, not as it relates to housing or health. And so I think the real issue is, has the governor defined himself in these first 3 years? If so, along what lines? What are the issues? And if you had asked the audience out here, I wish I could, what are the issues that stand out as it relates to the favorability of the governor? Our polls don't ask that question. We couple it by saying what's favorable. The sands in the hourglass are running thin. He's got only a few months left. Other than that, he would have to cast his lot for the future on something else. I would be seriously thinking that he might want to run for U.S. Senate against Mark Warner, but he has to establish a record. And I think even though he has a short time left, he still has time to identify himself with issues, with attempting to do something and doing something.
Here's a second question. I'm going to start this with Susan. Can you speak to the subject of foreign influence, either China or Russia, impacting our social media, and what does that mean for the election?
Well, I do want to weigh in first on the Youngkin question, too. I think it's going to be important to see what happens with this election in terms of how moderate or traditional Republicans actually vote. Because Larry made a comment that was a little tongue-in-cheek when he was talking about that many Republicans would be happy if Donald Trump doesn't win the election. And I think there is a lot to be said with that, because Trump has alienated a lot of traditional Republicans. He has alienated a lot of individuals who worked within his own cabinet. And so I think Youngkin's future is going to largely be dependent upon what we see happening in this election relative to the Republican vote. Now, if the Republicans stick with Trump, as our polls seem to suggest that he will, then that suggests that the Trump era will continue, and the far right of the Republican Party will continue to be the defining feature of the Republican Party. If more of those break and decide for the longer term, you're going to have to vote for Harris, which of course they're not going to say publicly, and why would they? But in the privacy of their own voting booth, they decide this is the best way to get the Republican Party back and to get past the Trump era. And so if they decide to do that, then there's room for the more moderate wing of the Republican Party. The problem, though, that I feel that Youngkin has from a national perspective is that I don't think he would be attractive as a national candidate based on either of those scenarios, because I don't think he would be viewed as far right enough for the far right, and I don't think he would be viewed as moderate enough, again, because of some of the stances that he has chosen not to take, for those who would be trying to rebuild more of the Republican Party.
So Susan, I'm going to add on one thing and get back to the other question. One of the things that has struck me is that his approval rating has often seemed to me to be higher than his electoral impact. So when I looked at the House of Delegates and senatorial races that we just had, what you find is that he got involved in a lot of them, put a ton of money into many of them, and they were unsuccessful. The Democrats, wound up with majorities in both houses. So I'm not sure that that whatever folks think, things are going pretty good in Virginia, so everything's okay, but they don't seem to listen to him very much about these matters. And then on some of the issues that he put forward, turned out to be a debacle, actually, which was the 15-week abortion ban. That he thought that would be a compromise between keeping Roe v. Wade and like a DeSantis 6-week abortion ban, but the public doesn't see it that way. You have 60, 70, 80% of the public saying they prefer going back to Roe v. Wade rather than searching for something, a different number of weeks on that front, on reproductive rights. So I think that is still probably a weakness. But what I was struck by more than anything else was how much money was put into those races and how difficult it was to move anything. And we saw that particularly here in Henrico County, where Skyland Van Valkenburg wound up winning that race by 10 points, and Rodney Willett, just won very, very easily in two races where the governor had been involved personally in making commercials and raising tons of money. So I think that is the reservation I would have about his capacity to convert, in some ways, what we're seeing in some of the polls to another electoral victory immediately in Virginia or the nation. So let me get back to the...
Okay. So relative to the more global question with China, I think one of the things we're looking globally, there's a concern in the United States about the decline of democracy. We've been talking about the decline of democratic values, and what do we mean there? We mean, the rule of law, freedom of expression, free and fair elections, those types of things. I think globally we have to keep in mind that across the world, democracy has been in decline for at least the past 16 years. If we look at data that has come from the Freedom House, and they divide over 200 countries into a weighted index, and they look to see is a country free, partially free, or not free. 8 in 10 individuals around the globe live in a nation that is either partially free or not free. So democracy is on the decline, and so what is replacing it? And it's authoritarianism that is replacing it. And I think we are not seeing the actions of the United States and how they play into the larger global world. So that makes countries like China and others in a better position relative to global affairs, and I think is something that we're not being cognizant of. Our own freedom score, even though the United States is still considered free in their scoring index, we are less free. Our points have gone down. So countries that are considered more free and have a more democratic values, our neighbor to the north, Canada, Australia, Belgium, I mean, there are a whole host of countries. And so one of the things that I think is problematic is that even those more authoritarian regimes are becoming even more so. And that's what we're seeing as a rise across the globe.
Larry, what are you seeing in terms of that influence of these other countries, and what kind of impact does it have? Is it just something on the margins, on the edges, or does it have a real impact on what's going to occur?
I think it's more marginal at this point. It's getting worse. And obviously Russia, China, Iran, those are the three top, North Korea rather, those are the top four in terms of wreaking havoc in our election system. And they use, I guess, I don't think they have to work very hard to use X, or as I like to call it, Twitter, because Elon Musk is so supportive of them and the things that he posts himself. My God. I mean, it's shocking. It just goes to prove, just because you're a billionaire doesn't mean you're brilliant. Which is kind of comforting in a way, isn't it? You know, not many billionaires in here. Although if you are one, I'd like to meet you. Look, it's dangerous. We shouldn't allow them to do it easily. We have to work harder to shut them off. But it worries me because I think they do reach people on the dark web who are, shall we say, a little unstable. You know, have you noticed? I mean, if you've ever been on the dark web, I haven't, but some people have, and it's really worrisome. A lot of these young people who have gotten into deep trouble with violence and other things have learned what to do from the worst possible characters on the dark web, and they're easily manipulated if they happen to be weak for one reason or another. So it's something we all have to be concerned about, as well as AI. I mean, that's going to get worse and worse and worse, so that we won't even be able to tell whether something is real or not. And what do you do in a world where you can't tell what's real and what isn't?
And Dr. Holsworth, if I can add on to that, I mean, that is a real concern, right? I mean, we're thinking about how, you know, we're shaping views on people's views on the poll and politicians' views on things, and we assume the person we're seeing on TV or the thing that we've received in social media is what they stand for something. But we're seeing that completely manipulated. And we talked about young voters. We see a lot more, as Governor Wilder said, a lot more young individuals excited and involved in kind of the electoral process. But these are our same students that are engaged in social media, which is wonderful, but also likely to have that influence. So I don't have an answer, but I do think it's gonna have a play and an impact on people's views and values about individuals that may not even really be that individual running for office or that individual's actual position on that. That concept is something we really need to think about and think about how we're going to handle going forward. Because as Dean Gooden said, we want to continually increase that freedom stance and that freedom value of the United States, but we need to think about the roles that others have in impacting our decision-making when we're aware and when we're not aware. And AI is a big concern there.
We think of this incredible shift that we've seen in how people receive their information. That the younger people, TikTok having far more importance, and at the same time, the incredible decline of the newspaper industry, particularly the local industry, as we've seen here in Virginia, that has just been dramatic over the years, and that has a real impact in how much information people get, where they get it, and where they get challenged. Governor, here's a question for you, and I think I'm going to have to chime in as well. It's a VCU question. Have you any comments regarding Virginia's now freedom of speech and assembly following the events of April 29th on the VCU campus, which I think is...
I think you have some comments too, I know. Well, I think it was disappointing first. If we are supposedly wanting to have a nation of free people, free spirit, to cut off protest, to cut off demonstrations, to prohibit those kinds of things from happening, sends a message. And so the question is, what message does it send? It sends a message that it's not your university. It sends a message to the stakeholders that it's not your property. It belongs to whom? It belongs to the decision makers. The question is, who are the decision makers? And what caused you to make that decision? Are you prepared to defend that decision? Well, come out and defend it. And that hasn't happened. It's always someone makes a statement for someone else to make a statement for someone else. And so I think the students, to their credit, as well as to the citizens, they have supported openness in government, they have supported free speech, and they want, obviously within the means of safety and well-being, the opportunity of people to speak themselves. I encourage it, support it, and will continue so to do.
Well, what I would say, first of all, just in general terms, I certainly agree that there ought to be rules that ensure that students aren't intimidated, that property isn't destroyed, that there are clear rules and regulations that can be employed to kind of restrict certain kinds of activities that might occur during protests. However, when I go back to this particular question, on April 29th, we had VCU students outside the library for 4 or 5, 6 hours. There was not any sense that other students were being intimidated, that they were directing their ire in any particular way that were regarding anti-Semitic comments towards other students. I never heard that any of those claims were made. And then within 6 hours, to call in the riot police, essentially, and sort of pepper spray the students, I really found excessive. Then secondly, now there has been sort of a new rule promulgated about protests. And they include, again, there are certain things that should be there. But on the other hand, one of the rules is that anybody at VCU who is wearing a mask could be asked at any time for their ID. This is a university that has a hospital where every doctor and every nurse is wearing a mask at all times. This is a university that has, what I've had Muslim students who are covered, women students, you know, from head to toe, other than their eyes. There. Are they going to be, you know, how many times a day can they be asked for their ID? The rules make, in that sense, no sense to me on that front. And I'm worried that there is a situation where, again, due to political pressure, the university has in some ways accommodated itself to that political pressure in ways that have violated the basic principles of the university on that front. And I just think that it would be incumbent upon some members of our board to speak out about what is happening here.
Let me cut you off there. Why do you think we have not had a single member of the board publicly to speak out?
I don't know. I mean...
Do you see, is there any prohibition against it?
No.
Can that person speak?
I think...
Or couldn't they speak?
They could. I think it's been feckless, if you ask me on that front. Because, again, certain rules, regulations make an enormous amount of sense, and you want to specify that given what's happened nationally. But at the same time, I think you want to promote free speech, you want to promote students getting engaged in issues, and that is something that is a positive, not a negative to me, particularly when it really is something that's occurred for 5 or 6 hours, and because you had a tent there, it was appropriate in some people's minds to say, okay, let's call in the riot police to pepper spray these students. Should have never happened. Larry, you should say something.
He says, don't you want to add in? I said, I better not.
I told you about how fearless you were.
Yeah, I know that. I don't comment on other universities' controversies because at Charlottesville, we have a whole big plate full of them, and I don't want you commenting on them. We'll be here all night. So give me a pass on that one. I know it wasn't fearless, but what can I tell you? Maybe later I'll talk about it.
Okay.
In the 4th hour of this.
Okay, let me start this with Susan. How can we see civility return in political discourse? One of the easy ones.
Right. Thanks for all the easy questions, Bob. You know, it does come back to what are our expectations as citizens and what behavior do we reward? I mean, right now, I think, unfortunately, divisiveness has been rewarded. I mean, it's been rewarded at the ballot box, it's been rewarded at the Supreme Court level. I mean, that's what has been rewarded. And so politicians don't lead, they follow. And if we as citizens demand more and say that this type of behavior we're not interested in being as engaging in as part of our polity, then politicians will change very rapidly their approach and their commitment to divisiveness. You will see them turn on a dime and reach across the aisle because that is going to be what is going to be supported at the ballot box. So I think that becomes the onus is on us to not continue to reward this divisive behavior.
Governor, would you like to follow up on that?
No, I think she said it all. By that, and that's why I like the way we started. Politicians do what is demanded of them, not asked. You can ask someone to do something, they'll tell you to do something. When you demand it by saying, okay, you don't have to do it, but you're gone. Once they learn that, as Susan has pointed out, they will act, but they got to be demanded.
Larry? Civility in politics. I mean, your brand has been politics is a good thing. So.
I abandoned that one. And we used to have a little sticker that we gave to all students. Politics is a good thing. And that was during the tamer years of the 70s and 80s and 90s. And now we can't get anybody to wear it, so we tossed them. We have a new one that says politics is everything. It's hard to argue with that because now it is everything. But I mean, civility is a wonderful word, and it's a wonderful concept, and of course we should all aim to be civil. But it is also true in life that sometimes you can't be mealy-mouthed. You just can't. You have to stand up and be counted. And I once had a good friend of mine who was also a relative, long since deceased, who said that when she was on her deathbed, she wanted to think as she was dying, well, I stood for something. I stood for something. And it's just so important, I think, to our nature, to the nature of humanity, to want to make our lives worthwhile and to mean something. We have to stand for something. So we should always try and be civil, but I think it's also true if the matter is important enough and we feel strongly enough about it that sometimes being a little uncivil is necessary. I argued against civility. I mean, I've got tenure. I have tenure. It's not a problem.
Robyn, here's our final question for our group that we have time for today.
I don't get the civility one. I was so excited.
No. This one's more fun for you. How confident are you in your results in Virginia and national polls when polling's largely on cell phone, when calls are ignored, or answers are not truthful? Or some people do polls on a text poll and a 15-year-old can answer the poll.
So I'm so glad you asked that, Dr. Holsworth, because I get really excited talking about methodology. I know you guys are excited about that at the end of the night. I actually am very confident about our results because of the way in which we do our polls. So what Dr. Holsworth talked about there are a lot of polls out there that you can do on cell phones that I regularly get a poll that asks me about my views in an area I've never lived in my life. For whatever reason, someone had my phone number at one point in time that lived there, and no one ever checks to see that I still live I live there. We take a lot of effort and we spend a lot of resources in doing our polls because we make sure that we have actual human beings calling individuals, talking through the poll questions. We do a two-process system to make sure that you, one, live in Virginia, because you might have had a Virginia phone number, but thank goodness we don't have to give our phone numbers up anymore every time we get a new cell phone plan like we used to, but you don't live there anymore. You could live in California. We check that. We check that in a two-process system. That's expensive to do that, but it's important to us because it gets to the confidence in our results. So when we look at our methodology, we really do go the extra mile, spend the extra money, and take the extra time to make sure that we really are hearing from Virginians that live in Virginia, that assign to certain regions across Virginia, so that we can confidently say, this is what Virginians think about these issues based on where they live, based on their age, based on their demographics. And that's really important to us. I would say the other thing that I think is a bit unique in what we do as well is we spend that time when we create the script. So when real humans are calling you and asking you questions, and you might say, can you call me back? We do. And we follow up with that information. When you don't have clarity about a question because we're asking you about JLARC and they might not know what that means, we have a script that appropriately explains that but doesn't lead the respondent in a certain way. So the other last thing I will say that we do is, you'll notice our poll says what Virginians think, and then you can look at likely voters and registered voters. Several times tonight we've talked about what Virginians think and who shows up to vote. We don't just rely on registered voters. We think it's really important to hear the voice of all Virginians because we're hoping all individuals show up to vote, but we just don't rely on that registered voter list because it's really important to know what everyone thinks who lives in the Commonwealth.
Great explanation. Governor, we're very proud of the Commonwealth poll, but you've had some experience with polls itself, where they don't always capture things, and we've seen that in elections. What's your sense of that in terms of polls as a forecast always?
Well, I think that there's been tremendous improvement with polls as they've been taken, but I like to take my poll with the people. I like to talk to them. I like to see them, and I like to hear from them. And I like to hear what other people have got to say. I remember when I was elected, Larry, if you recall, the night I was elected, and I called you in the hotel, and they had me, the polls had me so way ahead, I knew I wasn't. And then I asked you, I said, Larry, what polls are out now? What sections of the state? And you told me, one or two, and once I listened, I said, thank you very much. And my son was there, he was resting. I said, Larry, let's get up, we're going to the hotel. We just won.
So Larry, let me ask the same question to you there, that we've seen some dramatic misses in these presidential elections in particular. 2022, the polls were really pretty good everywhere. But 2016, 2020, we've seen some big misses, particularly in these Midwest states. What do you think about that?
Well, in the case of the blue wall, it's more that white, male, non-college voters either don't participate because they don't like the media or whatever the case may be, or they're just tough to reach. And so a big chunk of people were being left out, and it turned out that they were critical to understanding what was actually going to happen in, say, 2016, where education became as important a variable really as race or gender or anything else. So that was a change. You always have to be aware of, you know, potential changes. But I do think the polling industry, and this is an excellent example, they've made adaptations. They are better than they were. They'll never be perfect. They have to continue evolving because other variables may become much more important than we had seen before. But they're better than nothing. You know, it's better than having a focus group, and focus groups have their place, but you know, focus groups like 10 or 15 voters and they have a conversation around the table. Terrific. You get some qualitative information out of that. But by no means is it representative, or does it really tell you about what the electorate is likely to do. So I think it's not only better than nothing, it's better than the alternatives. And I'm grateful that we have them. I still think polling averages are probably the best way to go. But you can mess those up too. We've got a number of organizations that are formed by a party to change the polling average. See, they tilt the results of those polls to their party, and then they're listed in the polling average, and it means the polling average is a point or two or three more favorable to their candidates than it would be otherwise. You can't ever guarantee perfection, but as long as we keep our eyes open, we keep working toward it, I think we can continue to do a better job, and you are. I think this poll has been very representative and seems to me to be accurate, or an accurate reflection of the people of Virginia.
Yeah, I would just say that, to echo the point that you've made, like for years we looked at Real Clear Politics and their polling averages, but now they include a lot of what people would call junk polls in the polling averages, so it really isn't the best place any longer to understand the polling average. And when some media places are using the Real Clear averages, I really think that's kind of mistaken right now as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I'm going to go around one more time. We'll start with Dean Gooden, then go to Robyn, Larry, and then the governor for your final comments and thoughts on what we've just spoken about today.
Well, first of all, I want to say thanks to our remarkable group of experts here, as well as to you, the audience, for a wonderful discussion tonight. I would make two things that I'm going to be interested in following in this selection in particular. One I already mentioned, and that is, what will the Republican vote actually be like? You know, there's a group out there, Republicans for Harris. How strong will they be? You've got folks like Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney who have come out publicly to say they are voting for Harris. I think that might be a group of folks that we're not getting a good pulse on in terms of the polls. Again, because I think there is a strong socially desirable response when being polled by pollsters that Republicans might give. So, you know, could be way off there, but that's a group that I'm interested in watching on the real poll day that counts, which is November the 5th. The other thing that I think is going to be interesting to see is to be able to understand the impact of the Divine Nine. Mainstream America isn't largely aware, doesn't really largely understand Black Greek organizations. President Trump, former President Trump, made a reference to it when he said in the debate Kamala Harris was out with her sorority sisters or something like that. And I think for a lot of folks it really wasn't understood. But you know, Kamala Harris is the first candidate that we've had that's been a member of the Divine Nine. She's an Alpha Kappa Alpha, AKA. And, you know, Barack Obama did not pledge. So to really understand the impact of these organizations on being able to get out the vote, register individuals to vote, you know, I'm a Delta, but I have a lot of respect for my AKA sisters. And I feel like the impact of Black women in particular on this election in states like North Carolina, where you've got 10 HBCUs and very, very strong Greek organization, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what is the legacy of the Divine Nine in this election.
hard to follow that, Robyn, but
It is very hard to follow that. Actually, so the first thing I'm going to say that I'm looking forward to is those polls results that we will have out shortly to see any impacts that the debate has had on voter behavior, what that 10% looks like, what happens with those independents. Those are who I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to, especially those individuals who said they are not quite sure who they're going to vote for yet. I think they're learning a lot more about the candidates, so I'm going to continue to track those independents. I'm going to revert back to that civility question for 1 minute to say my last comments, which are, and I said this last year, I think that DC could learn a lot from Virginia, and we've got many members of the General Assembly here, and we watch civility every legislative session, in recent history, different parties, different ideas, and everything, and we get things accomplished, and we get things accomplished in a respectful way. We cross party aisles, and we continue to move things forward legislatively. And as you remember, I mentioned Virginians think very positively, consistently of the work of the General Assembly. So, there was a great article that was written last General Assembly session that talked about that from a political reporter that spent many years down at the Capitol to say that, if you want to see good legislators who engage in civility on a regular basis, spend some time at the Virginia Capitol. And so I look forward post-presidential election to reminding many people in Virginia and throughout that we do know how to practice good political civility in the Commonwealth. So,
Larry?
Very briefly, I hope that as we're listening to the people are listening to this question: what is the best thing for our country? How can we get back to a time when, even though everybody disagreed and we had lots of arguments and debates, in the end, after what was decided, after an election result was in, we got back together and said, let's move forward and do the best we can. That is where we need to go. And to go there, even though I agree, let's not go back. In that sense, we do need to go back.
Governor.
I just want to say thanks. And I say thanks not for what you've done for me, but for allowing Virginia to be an example, as Robyn has pointed out. People come from all over the nation to live in Virginia, to serve in the Senate, to serve in the Congress, to serve in the government. And after all, this is where it all started to begin with, in Virginia. And so I can't express my gratitude for what you've done for me and mine, and what I see the potential for further development of that human spirit, that kindred spirit, to make all of us proud to be Virginians. God bless.
Before I turn this over to Dean Gooden for our concluding remarks, I think it'd be appropriate for us to all stand and congratulate the governor, actually, for all he's done for Virginia and for VCU.
Well, I just want to say thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Governor Wilder, for your leadership of this symposium. Once again this year, it's been absolutely phenomenal. Thank you for your excellent model of leadership of putting country before party. And thank you, Dr. Holsworth. Thank you, Dr. Sabato. Thank you, Dr. McDougle. Thanks to each of you, and have a great evening.